Hey, what's up, everybody? Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of our very own fee-only certified financial planners. Please note this podcast is intended for educational purposes and should not be considered financial or investment advice, as we do not know all the variables to one's personal situation when answering a question. Before we jump into today's question, a shout out to our extraordinary YFP financial planning team that makes this segment possible. Your Financial Pharmacist offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. So whether you want to pay off your student loans, make the right investment decisions, or simply build a solid financial plan, we'll help get your income working for you rather than the other way around. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from Andrea in Olathe, Kansas.
Hi, this is Andrea from Olathe, Kansas, and I had a question on long-term disability insurance. I understand with short-term disability insurance that after so many days, your employer will have it put into effect, and then it carries on through 12 weeks. And then at that point, your long-term disability insurance would kick in. But if you're entitled to FMLA and it only holds your job for 12 weeks, I'm just curious how long-term disability insurance works. Since after 12 weeks, you might not have your job any longer. Are they able to let you go while you're on disability insurance, or does that protect you? I currently have both through my employer just in case something should happen, but I'm just curious how it really does work.
Thank you, Andrea, for submitting your question to be featured on this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
This is really think of this in really two different buckets. So you have basically questions around FMLA, which is basically a federal law. And then you have short-term and long-term disability policies, which are these are insurance policies. So start with FMLA. FMLA basically is a federal law that provides job-protected unpaid leave from work for certain family and serious medical reasons. And this is provided by many employers, or by law, around the United States. And I think that the threshold is if the employer has 50 or more employees, that you're essentially covered under this. And this was instituted back in 1993 by President Clinton. So I think some of the reason for this is that expectant mothers would go out on leave, or after giving birth to their child, and then they would come back and their job would be basically filled. So it entitles the employee to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and then when they come back from that leave, the job should be there for them, and during that leave, they still get the same health benefits, etc. So the big thing here is just really protection of the job. The insurance policies, long-term or short-term and long-term disability, it provides a different type of protection, and they can actually work concurrently. So in short-term disability, to Andrea's point, you typically have an elimination period. So this is think about you're paying a deductible, but in time, not necessarily dollars. So I think in her case, you have a amount of time. So let's say on January 1, you're deemed disabled by a physician. Then let's say you have to wait a week for you to claim a benefit. You wait a week and then you file a claim, and then you get typically a % of whatever your pay is for 3 to 6 months. So that's a short-term policy. So during that, the protection really here is not necessarily the protection of your job, it's the protection of your pay. So in her case, in a lot of cases, once the short-term disability is exhausted, then the long-term disability typically picks up, not in all cases. And for a lot of employers don't provide short-term disability. Some don't provide long-term disability.
Right.
So sometimes there's a gap there that if you don't have short-term disability, you definitely should look at an emergency fund, or your own policy, which can be kind of prohibitive. So maybe just an emergency fund. So long-term disability picks up, and typically long-term disability can go for 24 months, 36 months, go to a fixed age, or to your retirement age. So it's very nebulous in terms of the long-term disability policy. But the big difference for short-term, but more important long-term, because it's longer, is that it doesn't provide a protection for your job.
Right.
So short-term disability benefits, long-term disability benefits does not provide the employee with job protection. So the requirements to hold an employee's job really is going to be a matter of the employer's internal practices and policies, and to the extent of the federal law, which is outlined for in FMLA or even the ADA in certain extents. So to answer your question, Andrea, if we play this out, let's pretend you were to unfortunately, become disabled on January 1. You would have your disability policy that would pay you, 50, 60, 70% of your income. FMLA concurrently is holding that job for you for 12 weeks, but it's unpaid. Long-term disability kicks in after the short-term disability exhausts. And then it's kind of nebulous in terms of if your employer will hold your job or not. So long-term and short-term disability protects for your income. FMLA for that 12 weeks, 26 weeks if you're caring for a service member, I should mention, basically protects your job and no income. Those are the things that are going on. So if this were to happen, obviously you want to be in contact with your employer to understand what's going on. Some people will take FMLA, but then they'll pair it with sick leave or paid leave just so they have some income, especially if they don't have an emergency fund or they don't have disability. So it's going to be really important that you're communicating in the event of a disability with your employer to make sure that you're protected both on an income perspective, but then also a job perspective.
Great explanations. FMLA, short-term, long-term disability, certainly not a topic that's easy to understand or navigate. Couple resources that come to mind for listeners that are perhaps hearing some of this for the first time or want to brush up or learn more on disability policies. If you go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and at the top, you should see an option for protect your income. And then from there, you can get more information, education, resources, check rate quotes on disability and life insurance. And we also, I remember this vividly, Tim, when we wrote Seven Figure, this section took us a long time to write. And as you know very well from working with clients on this topic, because of the way these policies, especially long-term disability policies, are crafted, there's a lot of variability out there in those policies. There's a lot of riders and there's a lot of confusion that can be had in the purchasing of those policies. And so we spent a lot of time in writing Seven Figure Pharmacist trying to break down this topic of disability insurance in a way that was easy to understand, to digest, and ultimately to apply to one's financial plan. So if you go to sevenfigurepharmacist.com, you can get a copy of that book if you don't already have it. And coupon code YFP will get you 15% off that book. So Andrea, great question. Topic that we've talked about before, I think somewhere in the episode 40s. We'll have to link to that in the show notes. I'm losing track, Tim. I used to be able to fire those off episode by episode, and I've lost it now that we're far away from that one. So we'll link to that episode that we talked about on long-term disability insurance in the show notes. And Andrea, thank you again for submitting your question to be featured on this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the podcast. And as a small thank you, we're going to be sending Andrea a super comfy YFP t-shirt. And we would love to hear from you. If you have a question that you would like to have featured on an upcoming episode, please go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP or shoot us an email at info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Have a great rest of your day.